soon be done with troubles and trials. When I get home on the other side, I'm gonna shake my hand with the elders, tell all the people good morning, sit down beside my Jesus, sit down and rest all the while.
That's it. Well, my mother used to play those kind of songs all the time. But you know what? You know what was quite significant about those songs was that they reflected missionary theology, the kind of ideas that Christian Africans were taught in the Caribbean, which made them think about the life to come, heaven, rather than the life here on earth. Do you remember, think about how many songs we used to sing about in the sweet by and by. We shall reach on the beautiful shore. There were songs of hope, and they gave people comfort, but what it meant, to use an African-American phrase, was that we were more concerned with the pie in the sky than with the meat on the plate while we wait. And as a consequence, we didn't engage with political issues. And one of the political issues we didn't engage with were issues around black identity. But that wasn't the case for my father. Because you see, my father, Leonard Beckford, he listened to what my mother used to call the devil's music on the stereogram. So he would listen to the Pioneers. Do you remember Long Shot Kick the Bucket? About the racehorse? Who could write a song about a dead racehorse and make money out of it? Long Shot Kick the Bucket. But also, do you remember Young, Gifted and Black? That's it. Well, that's another one that my father used to play on the stereogram.
Young, gifted and black. Oh, what a lovely, precious dream. To be young, gifted and black. Open your heart to what I mean. In the whole world, you know, there's a million boys and girls who are young, gifted and black. And that's a fact. Young, gifted and black.
I'm sorry, I'd love to play all of it. We've got to move on. We're a bit limited in terms of time. But my father would play all of these songs about blackness. And so it got me a little bit confused, because on the one hand, just to say a bit about my father's music. My father did not see his music as devil's music. He saw it as spiritual music. So he would say sometimes, I'm going to play my sacred songs, almost to be in opposition to my mother. You see, because my mother thought only her songs were sacred. Now I know that what my father was doing implicitly was repeating a West African tradition. There's a West African tradition where, amongst the Yoruba people, where they believe good and bad is found in everything. And that even in what is called secular music or the devil's music, there's something good. If you want to find it, if you want to look for it, you'll find it. So what my father was saying to my mother, he didn't know he was really saying this, was, look, within the African tradition, before the missionaries came, we looked at everything and evaluated how spiritual it was, no matter where it came from. Now, he didn't say it in that kind of eloquent way. He usually cursed a few words that he'd learned as a youth on the streets of Kingston to explain what he was saying. But it got me thinking as a researcher, well, can we mix them together? Is it possible to have that Christian content that my mother was interested in, those Christian ideas about salvation, a God who works in the world, who transforms people's lives, but also take seriously my father's concern for black experience, particularly the things that we never explicitly address within the church, issues around racism. We don't talk about them explicitly. We talk about them implicitly. When somebody at my church, when I was growing up, was going through a hard time with a racist boss, they'd sing certain songs because they knew what she was going through or he was going through, but they never mentioned racism. They'd talk about, oh Lord, pour out your spirit upon her, and so when she's at work, the forces of evil will not come in the space, and the devil will be bound up in the name of Josh Shalabu Shalabu Shalabu. But the The point is, they never dealt with it explicitly, only implicitly. So what happens if we were to deal with it explicitly? Never talked about racism, never talked about slavery. In fact, we almost thought it was rude or somehow abhorrent to talk about slavery, yet slavery informed everything that we did. The cultural traditions that we had, the way we mixed and matched things came out of our African heritage, the history of slavery. We were not original. My name, one of the programs I made from Channel 4 back in the day, my real name is not Beckford. Beckford is the name of the family who enslaved me. They still live in Wiltshire and in Hull. You know, so how come we don't bring that issue to faith? What would happen if we had a dialogue with God and said, look, what do we make of this experience? We can't just say it was about wickedness. You know, how do we interpret this and make sense of it? Because one thing about slavery was about economic exploitation. And as we've seen in the previous lecture, the economic exploitation is still there in the music industry. So I thought, well, why can't we talk? But also, the church that I grew up with, the men preached, but the women did all the work. The men were in the leadership team, but it was the women who were running the church. So I couldn't understand. I grew up with 8 sisters. So, and all of them are prettier than me, cleverer than me. So I grew up in a household where I thought the women run things. But when I went to church, it was the opposite. So I was in shock. I was thinking, how can all these men be running the church when they're not as clever as the women? The women have the good jobs. So it got me thinking, well, why don't we talk about gender politics within the music as well? Why don't we bring that to God? So it got me thinking, is there any evidence of this kind of work within the gospel music tradition? And there is a little bit. If you go back to the late 1960s, there's a band called Out of Darkness. They were a British rock music band, and they had a black Jamaican singer. And they attempted to deal with issues around racism in one of their songs, just one of their songs of 2 albums. They touch on it, but it's in code. You wouldn't understand it unless you speak to band members what it's about. Remember Changing? Or Bazil Meade was in Kainos. And their track Changing, which was really about racial harmony. One of the few examples in gospel music history where people attempt to touch on it, but not in an explicit way. It's there generally about the need for us to live and work together in harmony. Also, Paradise had a couple of tracks that alluded to the idea of justice and needing answers to the way in which the world was going. It's only really in the advent of the last 10 years and with hip-hop culture that we find the willingness to address social issues. And if you remember the former gospel artist Bazil, our very own Witness, or even recently Triple O, they deal with social issues, but not necessarily explicit with racism, not necessarily with the history of slavery, but they deal with gun crime and gang violence. So for example, let's go back. Hold on, let's see. If I had time, I'd play a little bit of a track from, in fact, let's see if we can do it.
And Yeshua said, the greatest commandments to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and strength. And the second greatest command is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself, yeah. Tired of the shots firing, it's time to fight back with love. Listen, every day another gun gets manufactured, another man's blasted, and some blame gangster rappers. I ain't trying to say gangster rap's the problem, but it don't solve them, nah. It just keeps it revolving, and nothing won't change lest we change. If you wanna see change, then be changed, and rearrange your full pattern towards action. Cause if we do nothing, then nothing's what's gonna.
See, they deal with social issues, but the only social issue is gun crime and gang violence. And as we know, if people have studied this social phenomenon, it's related to wider social forces. Rich people don't do gun crime and gang violence. They might do other forms of crime. There are very few, if any, young people in gangs with degrees. So there are other issues at work that lead people into an outlaw culture. So what we're dealing with still is not the big picture, but just, again, missionary theology, personal morality, personal salvation. So I thought to myself, if there's no real history in this, is there a way in which we could do it? So I applied for some funding to the Bible Society. They gave me a little bit of funding to do some work around the Jamaican Bible, the Jamaican New Testament. Have you heard of it, the Jamaican New Testament? Yeah. So I said to them, what I want to do is I want to develop a social gospel music genre. And I'm not a trained musician. I'll come on to that in a little bit. I want to create a new genre, but I want to use the audio from the Jamaican New Testament as the background, as the main focal point, to then create this new kind of gospel music that would be Christian, but also talk about slavery, talk about racism, talk about gender politics within the church and society. And first of all, they said, yes, that's fine. So they gave us the money. So we started working, and the good news is, if you're not a musician today, the good thing is there's computer technology. So there's programs like Cubase, which mean if you're not a trained musician, it's very bad actually, because proper musicians, who train, like Pauline, for years to learn their craft, to become expert, I took the shortcut, which was to work with a producer and a computer, basically, to create the music. So this is the kind of easier way into it for the untrained people. So what I decided to do was then take the issue, two contentious issues within the black community, and create songs around them. The first one I want to show you is about the issue of deaths in custody. The hundreds of black people who have been killed in detention centers by the hands of police. We don't sing songs about that. We don't ask questions about, God, why is it they're killing us? What do you have to say about this? Maybe because the songs are important, because the songs are our theology. The songs are what we confess. And the word tells us if we confess it, it's going to be manifest. So what are we confessing out there in terms of our faith through our music? So what I wanted to do was, I worked with a producer called Tony Bean, local producer, and we produced this track, but we wanted to tell two stories. Visually, we tell the story about deaths in custody, but then we go back in time to talk about the Windrush generation. And the track itself is called The Incarnation, God Becoming Flesh, no blacks, no Irish, no. Because we wanted to tell the first story about discrimination, which was what happened to the Windrush generation when they came here. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this track. And what we tried to craft was a chorus line that would include no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. And if you know Darren Ellison, another local singer, church, used to be in the church movement, Darren Ellison flew, he was working with another artist, he flew in, and he did the vocals for us. I think his voice was a bit raspy, but we only had one cut. So I'm going to play you this track.
In 1954, about 10,000 West Indians came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey. Already their coming has caused a national controversy, but one point must always be borne in mind. Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny the mention. For all are British citizens, and as such, are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the Empire.
John chapter 1. No, the one where the world turn man. Him come live amongst we. Come live amongst we. No, the one where the world turn man. Him come live amongst we.
John 1:14 tells the story of Jesus' incarnation, that the Word becomes flesh and lives amongst us. It means that God, who is fully God and fully man, takes on human form. The incarnation means that unequivocally all creation is good, and that all flesh, no matter what color, no matter what tone, is good. My parents believed in this meaning of the incarnation, that their flesh was good. They were immigrants from Jamaica who came to work in Britain after the Second World War. But they soon came to realize that not everybody thought the same. When they went to look for places to live, they were greeted with signs that said,
no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs.
Sail 5,000 miles with the sun way up behind me. They said it's gonna be a while till I feel that warm again. Staring at the gray skies as the cold wind starts to soak me. Faces that I recognize, but no one this above, how my father served before me. Still no wise about the days that lay ahead. Hands and feet are free, but shackled by economy. Just the possibility of a better life instead. Maybe if you give me time just to let me tell my story, about how I came to be in the land of hope and glory. Moment that I touch the ground, all I see is consternation. You never let me explain that I'm here by invitation. Came expecting arms to hold and wide. No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs inside. The sign is plain and you don't try to hide. No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs inside.
Much of the outcry against the immigrants arises from the colour bar, which legally does not exist in Britain.
All of these are free to download. The whole album is free to download, so I'll tell you where you can get hold of it later on. So what we wanted to do with that track was create a gospel music genre then that dealt with issues of theology, the incarnation. What does it mean to talk about a God who dwells in all flesh, yet live in a society that says your blackness makes you a second-class citizen? How do we reconcile that? And at the end of the song, I try and reconcile it theologically. What does it mean then? Maybe it means that the European tradition were completely incorrect in terms of how they practiced the incarnation. They got it wrong in terms of what it meant. So again, thinking about how gospel music can articulate these two forms of consumption that I experienced in my family. Another track that I want to show you, this one deals with issues around gender. Do you remember what I said before? I don't know if it's the same in your church today, but the men were up top, and the women were doing everything. And I couldn't understand why they didn't reverse it. And I even found times, I'm sure this doesn't happen in your church, but there were these hugely talented women who weren't involved in leadership. And I couldn't understand it. So I thought, well, how do we celebrate black women within the context of the church and explore the issues that confront black women? So I worked with a local rapper. You may remember her father. Her father was a very famous bass guitarist. His name will come back to me now. I forgot, really famous, and I've forgotten his name. Ennis, Roger Ennis. Remember Roger Ennis, the bass guitarist? His daughter is a rapper, Justice Ennis, and we asked her to write a rap in relation to the story of Mary receiving the message from God that she is going to give birth to the Messiah, the Magnificat. But what we wanted to do with this story, because the Magnificat is really about a tradition in the Bible called the Great Reversal, where the high are brought down and the lowly are lifted up. And what we wanted to do was write a song that would express that meaning of reversal for black women. And so we interviewed black women about what are some of the issues that people talked about jobs, people about families, but one of the issues that reoccurred was shadism. And natural hair versus weave. So we thought, well, why don't we write a song that deals with the aesthetics, but visually about being black and celebrating within the context of the church, black aesthetics and the beauty of black women. So in this song, we have the visual is a choreographed piece by the Ace Dance Company. They're the only lottery-funded dance company within Birmingham. There's a choreographed piece which is meant to be Nanny of the Maroons, if you know your Jamaican history. And we drop into this choreographed piece images that we took at the black hair, care and beauty conferences around the country of black women with natural hair and dark skin to celebrate the way in which God has made all people beautiful, but also reverse the trend so that black is really beautiful and that we don't see that as being problematic. Now, if you know your music history, can you tell me the only genre, the only style of music created in British history explicitly for black women? There's only one genre where they said, we're going to make this music to get black women to come out and dance. It was Lovers Rock. So that's what we did. So we made the track a Lovers Rock track. Wow. There's some sanctified people over there.
What's the tune you got?
I believe we need to hear more women's voices in public life, in particular for the next generation. If we're going to change the dynamics of what we have today, where it is still sort of a man's world, then women today need to step forward to enable their children and their grandchildren, in particular girls, and actually boys too. Boys need to see that their counterparts can be equally respected in terms of the contribution that they bring to the table.
Luke chapter 1.
May God bless woman, cause the most powerful God do the miracle here for me. Him only God good can't done.
Oh him ladies, oh him girls, cause God has chosen you to save the world. Oh little women of the earth, feel like birds, you need to know your worth.
Him take him on and do some powerful sitting. Him scatter posing people. God all down ruler off of them high throne and lift up people when nobody never thinks they matter.
I said it's time for action. I'm slavery chain to the chain reaction. Oh yes, I'm a fighter, resistor, a daughter, a sister. I am a fraction of progress. Some don't lift a finger, but I ride the storm like the queen of Zinga. Because all through the process, trust me, it's mommy that knows best. Yo, we need justice and equal rights. Wanna rest in peace and we sleep at night. Fight for the children, they use and abuse them. The world of confusion, the lost, so we lose them to the streets. When no one keeps their eyes out for them, no one to protect or vouch for them. Let's reach out to the mothers of the earth. We do more than give birth, let's show what we're worth.
Him get hungry people, all heap of good sitting. But rich people, him send me with them 2 lamb hand. God help him serve at them, Israel. Him member for the good at cat.
Okay, so that was the song continues, and we insert more pictures. But the idea is to think about black aesthetics and the beauty of black people within the context of the church, with the context of Christianity. Not to say that somehow black is more beautiful than anything else. That's not what we're about. We're not talking about some kind of superiority, but to celebrate all of who we are in the context of God's creation. Again, a theme that we don't readily talk about, we wanted to bring it to the fore.